This presentation will provide background on ADEQ SRO activities realized in the upper San Pedro River watershed over the last 18 months. The challenges facing the San Pedro are significant, and the goal here is to build a foundation for new problem-solving events and projects moving forward. I've recorded this presentation for the benefit of invited management or staff who could not attend the original presentation. The part of the San Pedro River watershed that we'll be focused on extends from Cananea in Sonora northwards to Benson in Arizona. The river flows from south to north. On the U.S. side, the San Pedro River is listed as impaired for E.Coli and copper from the border with Mexico to the Charleston Gauge, and for E.Coli from where the Babocomari River meets the San Pedro northwards to Benson. And of course, we have the reach south of the border, which is likely impaired for E.Coli and copper due to raw sewage and copper tailing impoundment discharges if U.S. standards were applied. This is relevant to the impairment where it begins north of the border, given that we have no jurisdictional authority over sources south of the border, and yet this reach is likely contributing to the impairment in Arizona, as I'll explain shortly. Since the San Pedro headwaters begin in Sonora, let's begin by focusing on the reach south of the border. Within that reach, we're working with 37.8 miles of drainage with headwaters beginning in Cananea. Let's focus in first on Cananea. Based on information compiled by the Border Environment Cooperation Commission, I conservatively estimate that we have about 250,000 gallons of raw sewage that's discharged to San Pedro daily due to lack of wastewater infrastructure serving the community of Cananea. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, E. coli associated with those discharges can live in soil up to 20 days and in sewage for up to 50 days, assuming we don't have a chronic influx of sewage. Couple this with the fact that much of the city lies within the San Pedro River watershed, it's clear to see that these fluxes can easily be picked up by multiple stormwater events in the summer, as is common for our region, which are subsequently deposited downstream in Arizona. We also have a suite of ejidos, or communally owned ranches between Cananea and the border, and which host agricultural activities such as cattle ranching. And with respect to copper, there are mine tailings impoundments associated with one of the world's largest open-pit copper mines. One of those impoundments is known to leak acid into tributaries like El Barrilito, which discharge the San Pedro River. Based on a University of Sonora study from 2006, those acid drainages result in metals accumulating in the sediments of the San Pedro River as far as 8 miles north of Cananea. And within the water column, we see significant total metals concentrations as far north as 24 miles north of Cananea, with copper yielding concentrations in the parts per million. According to a peer-reviewed publication by the University of Sonora, an analysis of iron and manganese oxides in river bottom sediments indicates that associated metals are anthropogenic in source, and that these metals can be released into the dissolved state through a suite of different geochemical pathways, potentially contributing to exceedances in Arizona. In response, the challenges have been captured as a binational priority for mitigation in the Arizona-Sonora Environmental Strategic Plan, championed by ADEQ and the State of Sonora Water Commission. This has helped to springboard strategies via a 319 grant with Watershed Management Group, with the project focused on boots-on-the-ground information collection and coordination with the municipality of Cananea and ejidos on green infrastructure, range restoration, and fencing. This is an ongoing project, and I can provide further details offline. Next, let's focus on the impairments north of the border. In support of our strategy, let's turn to a microbial source tracking DNA study that was led by the University of Arizona with support from ADEQ. For 127 samples collected in support of the project, 78% of the stormwater samples had concentrations of E. coli that were over 4 times the standard for full-body contact. This suggests that tempering stormwater contributions is important in moving the needle on water quality. The study also demonstrated that for the associated stormwater samples, 61% showed markers for bovine at an order of magnitude higher than markers for human, whereas only 28% had human markers that were higher than bovine. This suggests that on a basin-wide scale, agriculture realizes a more significant footprint relative to other sources within our control. This was an ADEQ conclusion that was shared with the University of Arizona, which agreed with our summary. Having said that, there are specific sources we should probably take a closer look at. I'll summarize a few for which we've collected some data. The first is the Huachuca City Wastewater Treatment Plant, which is made up of a suite of evaporation lagoons. These lagoons are filled with biosolids and have since been retired, but the facility wasn't properly closed, raising questions about potential contributions of E.Coli to the adjacent Babocomari River, which runs dry. I did manage to collect stormwater samples 1.4 miles upstream of the facility, as well as immediately upstream and downstream last September, and didn't see anything on the ground or in the data that would suggest contributions. However, I did collect samples from two small tributaries draining open range upstream of the facility and witnessed elevated concentrations suggesting grazed open range as a source. On the west side of Highway 90, about 4 miles upstream of the facility, I collected samples from low-flow events within the Babocomari from within this grazed corridor during dry weather. You'll notice that a sample collected upstream of the most heavily impacted portion of the corridor registered fairly low, but samples collected within the grazed corridor are much higher. I also collected samples during a stormwater event that suggests possible upstream contributions that were magnified significantly once stormwater had passed through the grazed corridor. I also sampled tributaries flowing through open range and private property draining to the Babocomari, which also came back relatively high. With respect to municipal sources, I pulled a sample last November from Escalupé Wash, which concentrates stormwater coming off of Sierra Vista, and witnessed relatively high levels, but not as high as I'd been witnessing for range conditions. I then proceeded to pull samples from culverts upstream of that site, and then I returned to Escalupé Wash to capture the resulting flood, which interestingly demonstrated a degree of dilution. I tried sampling the wash right before it enters the San Pedro River, but had to return to SRO to process samples within holding time before the flow made it that far. This is a site on the San Pedro at Palominas, which is just north of the border with Mexico. We worked with a private ranch to collect stormwater samples during a storm last September for flow that is captured by a road and discharges to the San Pedro across his property. His property hosts some horses, and we did see elevated E.Coli downstream of his shop in an area where water was pooling, which is information we hope will springboard a future project for improving range on his property. Although the Palominas levels were elevated, they were not as high as the significant numbers we've witnessed coming off of Greenbush Draw, which serves a private cattle ranch and also has the potential to capture stormwater flows downstream of Naco Sonora, which suffers from sanitary sewer overflows. However, it should be noted that when we collected the Greenbush Draw samples last August and September, it had been 9 months since we had witnessed any sewage discharges from Naco. Returning to the DNA study, that's a beautiful data set that clearly captures the disposition of flows, so let's drill a little deeper into what's going on with these stormwater samples, having such a high percentage exceeding our threshold. For this, we turn to this paper published by a researcher with ARS that alerted us to the fact that E. coli likes to hang out in freshwater bottom sediments and bank soils, and that it's the resuspension of sediments rather than runoff from surrounding lands that can create elevated concentrations of E. coli in water. So I concluded that, assuming samples were not collected during a first flush event, monitoring may have been more indicative of the quality of sediments, which can impact water quality during resuspension. This was shared and confirmed with the author of the publication during an ARS meeting last year. On that note, we determined that soil conservation via range restoration is critical, a point that was shared with the San Pedro and Hereford NRCDs. The ranchers agreed and gave us an opportunity to move away from discussions about E. coli and focus on something we could agree on, specifically soil conservation. To drive this point home, this is Mr. Neil Gintz of the San Pedro NRCD, who has a major wash that runs through his property near St. David. He suffered a 3-foot downcut event from one storm in September 2019, which is now putting his property at risk through likely head cutting. He is concerned about upstream activities that may be contributing to these runoff events and would like some help on improvements he can make on his own property to hold every single drop of water on site. Of interest, this feature drains to an impaired reach of the San Pedro River. So what has ADEQ done in the past to address these challenges? Well, over the last 25 years or so, we've invested close to $2.4 million in various projects across the upper San Pedro River Basin. And although these projects are valid in their own right, ADEQ is concerned that we've kind of taken a buckshot approach to addressing the impairment and would like us to focus a little bit more. My own focus is on the Babocomari subwatershed, which covers an area of approximately 311 square miles. Samples collected by credible volunteer monitoring groups have identified the subwatershed as an important source of E.Coli to the downstream impairment. Not only is this a problem for the San Pedro, but it's an issue for the Babocomari as well, which not only carries the same standards, but hosts perennial reaches. This summarizes a sampling event from March 12th of 2019, and you can see here how low flow off the Babocomari does contribute to increases in E.Coli counts in the San Pedro River. So back when I first started, I reached out to some local NGOs for recommendations on how we might address the impairment through recognized best management practices. In fact, the whole team spent 2 days on Valere Austin's ranch in the Chiricahuas, where we were given a tour of some of her own best management practices, details of which have been studied by the USGS, resulting in publications on the effectiveness of the same. Valere and a retired representative from the National Forest Service recommended that in order to fix the impairment, we should first focus on improving cattle distribution relative to upstream tributaries that contribute stormwater to the San Pedro, and that we could do this by creating opportunities for grazing outside of impacted channels as would be necessary to create alternatives for forage. Then we should focus on slowing stormwater flows with rockwork and native materials by stabilizing head cuts and pursuing rangeland restoration, first by focusing higher up in the watershed and then working our way down towards our impaired reaches. In fact, we're fortunate to have the Borderlands Restoration Network, which employs staff that work on these strategies in the Patagonia, Sonoran, and San Pedro River Basin, but more importantly have a positive relationship with the ranching community. Per CLO's recommendation, we work with Borderlands Restoration to develop a proposal to stabilize a headcut complex higher up in the watershed in an area known as Vaughn Canyon. And here you can see Vaughn Canyon, which is severely downcut, putting grasslands critical to tempering stormwater flows at risk. We worked with Borderlands on identifying opportunities for relieving pressure not only on Vaughn Canyon headcuts, but throughout the entire upper Babocomari subwatershed on the Brophy property. And this is an example of what was being proposed, essentially a suite of rock structures to halt and heal active headcuts that were putting stormwater pressure on downstream features while putting upstream grasslands at risk. We developed 2 versions of this proposal for 319 funding, but were informed by leadership that although these were reasonable proactive measures, these do not immediately translate to water quality improvements, and that we should adjust course, focusing on projects that would realize delistings sooner than later. As such, we refocused on the Chase Emmerson property, which is closer to the impairment and a source of cattle introduction to the Babocomari River. Mr. Emmerson's property encompasses approximately 480 acres, almost all of which is in an Arizona Land and Water Trust conservation easement, except for 2 5-acre parcels. Mr. Emmerson's property includes an entrenched tributary that is used by cattle to access the river. The property is bounded by state land to the west and private property hosting grazing to the east. Cattle from the adjacent private property access the Babocomari through this drainage, realizing impacts summarized in the sampling summary I shared in a previous slide. This is a photo looking upstream along that headcut which drains stormwater from impacted rangelands to the Babocomari. Here, the Babocomari is heavily entrenched and impacted by cattle, which I suspect are using this ephemeral drainage for water and shade before it discharges to the San Pedro River upstream of our impairment. Here's an aerial view of the banks of the Babocomari collected by one of our ADEQ drones immediately downstream of that headcut. Let's focus in on this area. This is typical of what we see along those banks. These are active valley-eating headcuts that are eroding and contributing sediment to the drainage. A sample collected from open range draining over this head cut registered a concentration of 9,208 CFUs per 100 ml, based on monitoring conducted in July of last year. Based on ADEQ modeling conducted by Juan, the contributing subwatershed was identified as one of the most important sources of sediment within the Babocomari subwatershed. This slide demonstrates the hosting subwatershed is mostly south of the border between Fort Huachuca and Chase Emmerson's property. We coordinated a meeting with Ryan Fitzpatrick of Fort Huachuca to investigate opportunities for new projects on the fort for the purpose of attenuating runoff that might otherwise flow to the Babocomari. Based on the modeling, we expected to see more of this on the fort. Instead, we encountered this, essentially stable conditions with laid-back banks armored with vegetation. This is ideally what we would like to see. Ryan Fitzpatrick noted that these washes are closely monitored due to required planning for field training activities, and that they rarely flow to Chase Emmerson's property boundary. In addition, any rainfall that might occur in this area is more likely to infiltrate when it lands on heavily vegetated soils like this. Given this context, we decided to see what opportunities lay on Chase Emmerson's property, making up the Arizona Land and Water Trust Conservation Easement. To help us narrow in on a valid BMP, we revisited past projects implemented in this watershed. We had recently reported a success story associated with the work in Canelo Hills. Work by the consultant Van Clothier of Stream Dynamics focused on using stormwater as a tool for restoration, thus turning a problem into a remedy. I'll share an example from Canelo Hills. This site hosts a cienega that was drying out as a result of a ditch that was diverting water and putting pressure on a downstream head cut. Through a series of careful surveys, Stream Dynamics determined where to plug the ditch and divert stormwater flows to an abandoned wetland. A receiving pond for diverted stormwater was excavated, and a gravel layer was discovered below grade. This gravel layer would become a conduit for diverted stormwater, resulting in the entire system being pumped up after one season. The increase in soil moisture through the cienega resulted in improved conditions for revegetation in the vicinity of the head cut, thus armoring the same without the need for further intervention. This common sense, low impact approach is something we wanted to explore on the Chase Emmerson parcel, so we invited Van to visit the site. This is a photo of Van walking that stretch of the Babocomari impacted by cattle. We can see here a complete loss of geomorphic diversity. These long runs shorten the flow path of stormwater, resulting in higher velocities and shear stresses for a given rainfall runoff event, contributing to further downcutting. In summary, the challenges associated with this property are significant, so we wondered if there might be similar things we might do on the floodplain to relieve pressure on this system. So we hired Stream Dynamics to visit the property and develop a prescription. In turn, I spent the week with Van to learn as much as we could about his methods in support of a strategy moving forward. And over the course of 4 days, we walked all the tributaries putting pressure on the downstream head cuts and shot longitudinal profiles to find opportunities for taking advantage of stormwater to restore the rangeland. The best way to summarize Van's strategy is through an analysis of this valley profile he drew on my iPad. Van looks for historical valley bottoms like this one that have been abandoned by new head-cut valley bottoms formed from old wagon wheels or cattle trails. The deep features trap stormwater, preventing it from wetting the historical floodplain, leaving grasslands high and dry and subject to scrub invasion. He sees these as opportunities for plugs which, when properly designed, can restore overland flow to historical valley bottoms, thus increasing opportunities for infiltrating stormwater and increasing rangeland moisture. This can help with rangeland restoration and also relieves pressure on downstream features like valley-eating head cuts or other sources of erosion. Finding these features can be relatively subtle, requiring careful observation in the field, and most times not something that can easily be spotted from Google Earth or 10-meter USGS digital elevation models. This really does require time away from monitors with eyes on the ground. On the Chase Emmerson property, we had multiple examples of poorly designed roads that were concentrating stormwater flow towards those head cut complexes. Van recommended that we consider rolling dips on the roads to divert water to the historical floodplain for the purpose of promoting infiltration while relieving pressure on erosional features. We did receive a formal prescription for the property and will reflect many of the comments and recommendations of stream dynamics in the 9-element plan required by EPA for this watershed, something that's currently in development. We've also been sharing our activities, data, and recommendations at venues hosted by important stakeholders like the San Pedro and Hereford NRCDs, the Upper San Pedro Partnership, the Sentinel Landscape Partnership, and via one-on-one meetings with the local NRCS offices. Feedback from all those meetings has been memorialized and will also inform the 9-element plan currently in development. Through all those meetings and stakeholder interactions, we managed to identify 7 projects within the Babocomari that historically would have merited consideration for 319 funding. Given the prerequisite for immediate results, we decided to focus on the 2 projects that are closest to the Babo's confluence with the San Pedro River. That's not to say that we've abandoned the other projects. In fact, they're tracked as proxies on our Trello board, but rather than fund those outright, we've elevated their status within NRCS, Sentinel Landscapes, and National Forest Service as priorities that could benefit from partner funding opportunities, details of which are tracked on the proxies. With respect to the Blackberry Lane fencing project, its purpose is to prevent cattle from impacting a perennial riparian corridor hosted on private property. This is the last stretch of the river before it crosses into the San Pedro Resource National Conservation Area managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Relative to other projects identified in the watershed, it's also the closest to our impairment. This project will protect a 0.59-mile stretch of riparian perennial corridor, which, according to the last 10 years of Nature Conservancy wet-dry mapping, is about 33% of the perennial corridor on the downstream reach of the Babocomari. This slide zooms us in a little bit closer, showing the extent of fencing agreed upon by multiple private property owners. Let's zoom in a little more to see what conditions look like on the ground. This photo was taken in late January during recon for another project. This is fairly typical of what's witnessed throughout this perennial reach. This is of concern since research shared by the University of Arizona suggests fecal coliforms can be released for extended periods of time from cow patties. The results of the associated study were formally published in 1983 and are frequently cited by other researchers. Backing out a little more, we can see that this corridor is impacted throughout by cattle to include lack of recruitment of younger trees. And here's some monitoring data pulled by Ron Tiller and I this month. You can see that upstream of the impacted corridor, E.Coli numbers are relatively low, and then increase above standards for full body contact at the downstream end. Ron and I witnessed rope swings and ladders visible within the corridor, suggesting humans do use this area for recreation, so the full body contact designation is reasonable as it relates to E.Coli. This is a rough approximation of the riparian area that would be protected by the proposed fencing. So how much fecal matter would be fenced out if this project were approved? Let's start with overall loadings associated with the operation. Reflecting on comments made during Hereford NRCD meetings, we've been informed approximately 30 cows are currently distributed across all leases in this area, including those on the BLM managed Sprinka. In regards to the cattle in the riparian corridor, we've been informed the cows are introduced in late November but then removed in March to meet requirements to protect southwest willow flycatcher habitat on the Sprinka managed by the BLM. That's about 4 months or 120 days in open range and BLM leases where grazing is allowed in the corridor, although we believe this is a conservative estimate since Ron and I witnessed cattle in May. Reflecting conservative assumptions and using numbers published by NRCS, this suggests a total loading of 36,468 cow pies are deposited on open range and state and federal leases during this 4-month period. However, we're only focused on protecting this narrow strip of open range. To understand what the impact is on the fence corridor itself, let's take a look at some drone data that was flown in February. Based on what I've witnessed on the ground, I believe this is a representative sample of the annual loading of cow pies. If we multiply this concentration by the associated protected area, we come up with 4,909 cow pies introduced into the corridor annually. That's about 13% or 2 weeks of impact out of the 4-month rotation where cows are allowed in all the drainages associated with BLM and/or state land leases. We suspect this loading reduction is low since the rotation was visible through May rather than March, and since the rancher will host more cows when the range can support the same during wet conditions. Regardless, we'll use it as a conservative estimate to calculate total loadings reduction for the lifespan of the project, which, assuming a 20-year lifespan, comes out to be about 100,000 cow pies or close to 700,000 pounds of fecal matter over 20 years. Without a formal survey, we don't know what the cost for the fencing is going to be, but initial estimates came in at $60,000. We think this is low given the complicated terrain and some ideas we have for innovative cross-channel fencing to ensure sustainability, so let's add 50%. Assuming the number of excluded cattle doesn't increase over time, the cost for fecal matter removed over the minimum expected life of the project, or 20 years, is 91.6 cents per pie, or 13.1 cents per pound removed. The economics will improve should the rancher decide to increase the number of cattle under management, as has been the case in the past, or should the life of the fence line make it to 30 years. That's one helpful metric, but to help visualize loadings in terms of volume, I decided to calculate how many 5 cubic yard dump trucks would be removed in 1 year. That really depends on the density of the manure, which is a function of how long it's been sitting on the floodplain. Based on measurements taken in the field, we would offset about 4.5 5 cubic yard trucks of fresh sticky manure and as much as 24 trucks of bone-dry manure. I did find a publication that provides particle density for the manure of farm animals. And what particle density essentially does is remove void spaces from the calculation for density. According to this publication, the density of beef cow manure is closer to 1.33 grams per centimeter cubed. If we use that published number, we offset about 3 of these 5 cubic yard trucks. One more way to visualize this is to consider this photo of dino poo from Jurassic Park shared by one of my colleagues. Assuming these have the same density of cow poo, and by making some additional simplifying assumptions, each one of these is about 1/5 of a cubic yard. I know this looks larger, but keep in mind that there's probably a little Hollywood magic going on here using perspective to make this pile look bigger than it probably is. So does anyone want to hazard a guess at a dino poo equivalence deposited by 30 cows in this corridor over the course of 4 months? I calculate the number at 79. Having said that, we have to acknowledge this project doesn't help us relieve pressure on drainages that run through open range or leases on BLM and private property. I personally have suggested extending the project via conversations with lower-level BLM personnel and outreach to private property owners, but I've not been able to mitigate incentives or jurisdictional considerations as of yet. This calls back to comments I've made at previous problem-solving events regarding challenges related to scale, where individual projects can be significant in their own right, but when viewed in the context of all factors, are challenged in realizing the impacts management wants to see. Realizing those impacts may require higher-level conversations between ADEQ and partnering agencies. To drive this point home, let's compare the loadings for our modest project relative to the loadings for the entire corridor. Here, you can see the total loadings deposited along associated open range and leases. This is how much is excluded by our fencing project relative to the remaining properties. So how does this information tie into our strategy? As it relates to the environment, in order to realize immediate water quality improvements, we need to encourage redistribution of grazing activities away from points of concentration for stormwater, such as washes and rivers. Feedback from NRCD meetings indicates this is a contentious issue for the ranching community. So as it relates to socioeconomic impacts, we should also consider that if redistribution impacts rancher operations, we should explore rangeland restoration and off-site water supplies so that ranchers have viable alternatives in the short run. This helps ensure accountability on both sides and reflects voice of the customer regarding concerns over ADEQ's interest to redistribute cattle from riparian corridors and drainages. Frankly, this approach is not much different from what was proposed by our watershed experts over a year ago. Regarding a rancher that would be impacted by fencing on open range private property, he does own state land and BLM leases outside of the riparian corridor, but the associated parcels are heavily downcut with damaged roads. Downcutting challenges grasslands establishment critical to cattle operations since water sheds through washes rather than over the floodplain. Here, you can see the condition of the state land lease, so it's understandable why ranchers might prefer to graze in the riparian corridor, which hosts a greater density of forage. At the same time, if this rancher is fenced out of downstream riparian areas, he might put additional pressure on unfenced private property and drainages within BLM leases unless we coordinate and support range restoration activities to help relieve that pressure. Along those lines, we've coordinated with Borderlands Restoration on a proposal to start rangeland restoration in the highest point of the watershed associated with his state land lease. The work includes installation of 25 robust erosion control structures to offset downcutting and stormwater impacts on downstream roads, acting as conduits for E.Coli to the Babocomari and eventually the San Pedro River. More importantly for the rancher, these features will also capture sediment for grass recruitment. When rotations are managed properly, this is a proven technique that can restore forage to support economic activity on the floodplain, but the BMP is rainfall and soil dependent, and thus can take some time to yield results. This is a concern raised by the rancher, and although he supports the project, he's asking ADEQ to consider an alternative BMP known as poop and stomp. This approach relies on feeding cattle native hay in degraded areas and then having the cows poop and stomp seed into the ground for grassland restoration. The challenge with that approach is native grass hay is not a readily available resource in Arizona. Furthermore, the state land leases are severely degraded, so restoration will be very challenging. Since the BMPs proposed for the state lease are rainfall dependent, predicted decreased rainfall may not realize the rangeland improvements necessary for relieving pressure on the unfenced riparian corridor or restoring soil stability, biological, and hydrological characteristics for a healthy rangeland. However, the Hayhurst component of this project can help the NRCDs recognize that ADEQ is listening to the voice of the customer and also give us an opportunity to measure the impact of our investments over time as a foundation for Plan, Do, Check, Adjust, which may require further engagement with state lands, Bureau of Land Management, and the Department of Revenue. This gets us to project risks and sets us up for a discussion of future problem-solving events. In line with our culture, management has communicated quite clearly that waters are not being delisted fast enough. Again, in line with our culture, we have to ask why this has been such a difficult lift. For starters, this basin started unraveling decades ago in response to drought and overgrazing, a fact that was acknowledged at the Santa Cruz NRCD back in February, and continues to be relatively unstable, as clearly evident in this photo. Given this context, I've reviewed papers recommended by the University of Arizona that confirm restoration is a long, slow process that must be carefully managed, noting that conditions can slide back much more quickly than the time required for restoration, so there's no guarantee our investments will pay dividends in the long run. With respect to the Blackberry Lane fencing project, let's be clear that given lack of regulatory tools to control access to open range or BLM leases, there's no guarantee that the unfenced corridor will not continue to be impacted by existing leases and/or open range access to unfenced private property. The issue of scale comes up again when we map our project areas, shown in yellow here, relative to the alignment of all the drainages that we're trying to protect, which lay mostly on private property, shown in white. So although we can impact locally, these are really drops in the bucket relative to the challenges posed by open range and tax incentives on private property. Regarding tax incentives, I first came across the challenge while surveying the Santa Cruz River for a cleanup project a few years ago with a friend. While surveying the river, I witnessed massive amounts of cow poop in the channel proper and asked my friend, who owns land near the river, how this could be. Mike informed me that private property owners invite ranchers to graze their cattle in the river in order to take advantage of lower agricultural tax rates. This is a bit ironic since we're working with ranchers to implement 319-funded BMPs higher up in the watershed without addressing an obvious incentive to impact the drainage itself. Not only is this an issue for water quality, but livestock in the channel contributes to soil compaction and cattle trails, while contributing to head cuts. This impacts the physical integrity of streams, which in turn impairs physical buffering capacity during stormwater flows, contributing to more erosion and suspended sediment, which we already know is correlated to E.Coli. To remedy this challenge, we've identified buffer strip tax incentives used in agricultural areas in the Midwest as a model for Arizona. I've shared this idea with the NRCDs, which has been met with some resistance. Note this exchange that took place during the May 20th Hereford NRCD meeting, where a member of the public raised concerns about cattle impacting the Sprinka managed by the BLM. Although the public was simply asking for education and outreach, the NRCD response was, BLM fences have been down, and if they don't fence it out, it's their problem. Regarding revenues, we also need to consider that most of what state lands takes in for leases is minimal compared to other states, most of which goes into public education. That leaves 319 with our primary funding source for BMPs, but with recent changes to the Clean Water Act, I suspect we'll lose federal funding for waters that we might otherwise want protected under Waters of Arizona. Where will this funding come from, especially when we compare current revenues against anticipated costs? Even if we drop these costs significantly, we're still going to need a sustainable revenue stream for effective loading reductions. One issue that we only briefly touched upon is the fact that there are degraded roads on state and federal public lands. These roads become focal points for stormwater and, if not properly maintained, can increase stormwater pressure on downstream erosional features like Vaughn Canyon, as we witnessed during a field trip to the Canelo Hills allotment managed by the National Forest Service on March 3rd. Again, economics comes into play when we consider that the revenues for associated off-road activities may not likely address the road maintenance budgets for the same. In regards to the Forest Service, they indicated that their road maintenance budget is supplemented by Border Patrol, but that Border Patrol road maintenance priorities may not align with their own. Scale comes up again when we consider that about 1/3 of our upper San Pedro River watershed is located in Mexico, where we have no jurisdictional authority. And although we're working with Watershed Management Group to educate and train ranchers on how to better manage grasslands upstream of the border, the scale of the challenge is one that will take continuous engagement and careful management over time. If we make these investments and then walk away without maintaining the binational relationships required to foster continued work, we're leaving much to chance. Finally, I understand that we need to take careful measurements to understand the impact of our projects over time, but let's be clear that those measurements are rainfall and stormwater dependent, which can realize signatures of activities from higher up in the watershed rather than from our own BMPs. In order to really understand how effective our BMPs are, we really need a local understanding of rainfall and runoff, which is why I've been testing and promoting the use of remote environmental monitoring technology so that we can put our measurements into proper context. Thank you.